young girl took over her sick mother's job cooking at a ranch. Lonely rancher gave her one chance. The sun had barely risen over the wide Texas plains when 12-year-old Clara pulled her mother's old apron around her thin waist and tied it with hands that trembled, not from weakness but from fear. The apron still smelled faintly of flour and onions, the familiar scent that had once filled the ranch kitchen where her mother, Marta, had cooked every day. But now Marta lay in bed, pale and coughing, her body too fragile to rise. Clara had sat beside her all night, listening to the rattle of her breath, whispering prayers into the darkness. When the morning light finally crept through the curtains, Marta had taken Clara's hand and whispered, "Child, go. They need their breakfast. Don't let them send us away." Those words were enough to carry Clara through the kitchen door of the sprawling Whitfield ranch. She was small for her age, with long braids that looked more like rope than ribbons, and eyes far older than her years. The ranch hands, big, weathered men who worked from dawn until dusk, looked up from their coffee cups when she entered. Silence fell. They were used to Marta's gentle voice calling them boys even though most had gray in their beards. Now it was her daughter standing before them, clutching a wooden spoon like a weapon. At the far end of the table sat Jacob Whitfield, the owner of the ranch. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with lines carved deep into his face not by age alone but by years of solitude and loss. His wife had died 10 years before, and since then he had poured every drop of himself into cattle and land. People called him hard, even cold, but those who looked closely could see that the hardness was more armor than heart. He watched Clara now, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's this?" one of the ranch hands muttered. "We gonna be fed by a child today?" Clara swallowed, feeling her cheeks burn. "Mama's too sick. But I can cook. Just give me a chance." The men exchanged doubtful glances. Ranch work demanded heavy meals, biscuits, bacon, gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Could a girl even lift the iron pans, let alone feed a dozen hungry cowboys? Jacob leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the table. His gaze held Clara steady, as if he was measuring something beyond her size. Finally, his voice cut through the room. "Let her try." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Clara nodded quickly, hurrying toward the stove. Her heart pounded in her chest like a runaway horse, but her mother's lessons echoed in her mind: knead the dough until it sighs, taste before you serve, and never be afraid of fire, fear makes the bread heavy. The kitchen filled with the sound of sizzling bacon, the sharp scent of onions hitting hot grease, the steady scrape of Clara's spoon stirring gravy. At first her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the skillet, but then something strange happened, her fear melted into rhythm. Cooking had always been the one place where she felt close to her mother, as if the act itself was a kind of prayer. When she carried the first platter of biscuits to the table, the men reached hesitantly, then tore into them. A moment later, silence was replaced by muffled grunts of approval. By the time breakfast ended, the plates were empty, the coffee pot drained. Jacob, still silent, rose and walked past Clara. He paused at the door, resting one hand on the frame. Without turning, he said, "Be here tomorrow." That was all. No praise, no smile. Just the permission to return. But for Clara, it was enough to spark a flame of hope. The days that followed were harder than Clara imagined. Cooking for a ranch wasn't just about food, it was about feeding men who wrestled cattle, dug fence posts, and rode for miles in dust and sun. She rose before dawn, often with her eyes still heavy from nights tending her mother. Her fingers blistered from scrubbing pans, her back ached from hauling flour sacks nearly as heavy as she was. Yet every morning, she appeared in that kitchen, apron tied, chin lifted. The ranch hands softened over time. They began leaving out extra firewood for her, or carrying water buckets without being asked. They teased her gently, calling her Little Miss Biscuit or the boss's cook. Even their rough laughter felt like acceptance. But Jacob Whitfield remained a puzzle. He spoke little, his face unreadable. Clara often caught him watching her, not with disapproval but with something more complex, like a man seeing a reflection he didn't expect. He began stopping by the kitchen at odd hours, sometimes to refill his coffee, sometimes with no reason at all. He would stand in the doorway, hands in his pockets, as Clara worked. He rarely said much, but when he did, it carried weight. Too much salt, he'd remark about the stew. Or, good crust on that pie. To Clara, those small words were like coins dropped in an empty jar. She treasured every one. Then came the day everything changed. A storm had rolled across the plains, fierce and unforgiving. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled like wolves. The ranch hands had driven cattle into shelter, returning soaked to the bone. Clara worked furiously in the kitchen, trying to prepare a hot meal to chase away the cold. She didn't notice when Jacob entered until she heard his voice. "Clara!" She turned, startled. He was standing close, closer than ever before, his face shadowed by the lamplight. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield," she asked softly. His eyes searched hers. "Your mother, she's worse, isn't she?" Clara froze. For weeks she had hidden the truth, afraid they'd send her away if they knew how sick Marta had become. But Jacob's steady gaze broke through her defenses. Tears spilled before she could stop them. "She hardly eats. She can't get out of bed. I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked, and suddenly all the weight she'd carried, the fear, the exhaustion, came crashing down. "I'm trying, I really am. But what if I'm not enough?" For the first time, Jacob's stern expression softened. He stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, his rough palm warm and steady. "You're more than enough, Clara. More than you know." The words cracked something open in him too. He remembered his own daughter, long buried in the ground beside her mother, lost to fever before she'd even reached Clara's age. He had built walls around his heart so thick he thought no child's voice would ever slip through again. Yet here was this girl, fighting with every ounce of her small strength, stirring not just meals but life back into a place he thought dead. That night, Jacob sent for the town doctor to see Marta. He arranged medicine, fresh linens, and even hired a neighbor woman to sit with her during the day so Clara wouldn't carry the burden alone. When Clara realized what he'd done, she wept, this time with relief. Weeks passed. Marta began to recover, her cough easing, her strength slowly returning. Clara no longer cooked out of desperation but out of joy, filling the ranch with smells of pies and roasts that reminded everyone of home. The men said grace before meals now, something none of them had done before Clara arrived. One evening, after the work was done and the stars lit the sky like scattered diamonds, Jacob found Clara sitting on the porch steps. She looked out at the land stretching endless and wild, her braid loose against her back. "You did more than feed us," Jacob said quietly, sitting beside her. "You brought something back I thought was gone forever." Clara tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" "Hope." The word hung between them, simple yet profound. From that night on, Clara was no longer just the cook's daughter filling in. She became part of the ranch family, her place as steady as the land itself. And Jacob, though he never said it outright, began to see her as something more, a reminder that kindness could rebuild what grief had torn apart. Years later, folks around town would still tell the story of the girl who took over her sick mother's job, who faced down a room full of doubting men with nothing but courage and a wooden spoon. They said it was the moment when the Whitfield Ranch began to change, no longer just a place of cattle and fences, but a home where hearts healed. But for Clara, it wasn't about legends or praise. It was about one chance. A chance given by a lonely rancher who saw more than a frightened girl. And in that chance, both found something neither expected: family. Because sometimes, the smallest hands can stir the deepest hunger. And sometimes, the hungriest soul is not the one waiting at the table, but the one who dares to offer a meal of hope. Sparkle's final message: the story reminds us that compassion, even in its simplest form, a meal, a helping hand, a chance, has the power to transform lives. It shows that hope can be baked into bread, healing can be stirred into stew, and family can be found in the most unexpected places.